Okay, so welcome to our session today. And usually we focus on the book, I Want to See God, that wonderful synthesis of the spiritual life as presented by Blessed Mary Eugene, as well as the second volume, I Am the Daughter of the Church. Today, Monique asked me to speak to you not from what he wrote, but what I, Kelvin, know of him, of my experience of him, and to speak of my brother, to put it briefly and shortly, wants me to speak to you of my brother. It's really a difficult task to speak of a brother, as usually we face the normal opposing principles of either embellishing the story, making it look so beautiful that it goes out of being natural and seem to be artificial, if you like, or to express it in a way that may not be helpful, in the sense that one may be seeking just the faults of the other person. At least this is not the panel for canonization. So we don't need to go the both sides of his life. Being in France for 3 years with my brothers in France and the province which Blessed Marie Eugene belonged to, he was provincial of that province when he died. And among friars who knew him so well, telling their own experiences of him, and encountering those other people who saw a different side of this same person, Blessed Mary Eugene, I am left to choose for myself the path to encountering this dynamic brother. In preparing this talk, since it's not our traditional way of commenting on a text, I was wondering on what aspect to talk to you about with Blessed Mary Eugene. I was wondering if to focus on his life in the family, his family experience, how that can be of help to families today. He had a family experience that it's both loving but difficult as well at different stages in his experience. I found that very helpful, as it tells us how natural we are as human persons. But that would take a lot of time and resources to do. And I don't know how beneficial that would be to you. I thought about that, and then another thought came to mind. His loyalty to his nation, his defense, patriotic experience, if you want to put it that way, serving at wars, wanting to give his life up for his nation. It is both a physical but a deep spiritual understanding that can help understand his journey in this aspect. Also, my attention was called to his experience in the seminary, coupled with the difficulties and struggles that come with choice of vocation. That was another difficult experience, which is true of us today. All vocations, married vocation, single vocation, vocation to the consecrated life, religious vocation, and clerical vocation come with their own crisis. And his story can help those who are discerning their vocation to build courage to persevere, the courage to stay, the courage to remain. But thinking about this aspect, another thought came to my mind. I just bringing to you the confusion I had in preparing this talk. I thought about his missionary zeal, his desire, burning desire for the salvation of many. Thinking about that, this will be something of great value, for he, drawing on the experience of St. Therese of the Child Jesus on her teachings on mission, Blessed Marie Eugene is fired up with zeal for the salvation of souls. A real model for today. With the different places he visited, in a world shattered by war and hatred, it seemed to be a great example today. But my mind also turned to another very controversial subject, which I experienced among our friars in Abini Occitan province. I call it controversial because I got different opinions about that, of his own concept of obedience, power, and authority. How he exercised this is the understanding, the vow of obedience, together with the concept of power and authority. It's a very interesting thing to talk about, also very controversial. As a friar would say, he gives order without any room for negotiation. It's a beautiful thing when a friar says that. On the one hand, we can see it as an invitation to understand the true meaning of obedience. But on the other hand, it could be an explanation or an interpretation that he was so strong-willed that you dare not oppose him. And not forgetting, he served not just in the province, but in the central of the order of the Carmelites. He was Vicar General in Rome. And when Father General died, he led the order to the next chapter, where the new Father General was elected. So he has played an important and decisive role in the order. But another thing came to my mind to talk about. It's rediscovery of the centrality in Carmelite spirituality. At this time, Carmelite spirituality was either being suspected of Illuminism or not really spoken about. The studies of Carmelite literature, the works of John of the Cross and Teresa, were just being talked about, if you like, rediscovered. And we see him passionate about this with the establishment of a Carmelite spirituality center in Rome, Theresianum. He was key to the foundation of that. His vision for the Institute Notre Dame de Vie, and how much he wants this experience of Carmel to be lived by all. Already projecting the universal declaration that Vatican II would make, universal call to holiness. When I thought about this last part, it would be going back to I want to see God and I'm a daughter of the church, which we'll be commenting on for over a year now. So in my confusion, I was wondering, what should I talk about today? Obviously, all of these aspects of his life that would take a lot of time and to talk to you about them rather than just give you a summary of all of this. So I went back to the email that Monique sent to me, and reading that email and the choice of the dates, I had to focus on something. 10th March 1922 was an important date in the life of Blessed Mary Eugene. We'll see that later on. But also she wants me to speak of my own experience of Blessed Mary Eugene. So going back to just brush up my understanding of his life, 2 years of his life fell to my attention, and that is what I want to present to you this evening. Or before that, there was also his devotion to Therese, which was really, really strong and great. Well, I wouldn't want to go into that, but there are 2 years I call 2 years of grace of his life, 1920 to 1922. I call it 2 years of grace, but they were the most, if you like, difficult years of his life. But these were the years that formed him, that shaped him, and was decisive for his life, his mission in the church. So I think finally I had to settle for something. So some other time we can talk about other aspects. You can see how my confusion led me far and wide. But rather than tell you the story of his life, I would like to offer you a man of courage, a man of hope. And that is why I added something to the theme today. Reading his life, will be surprised by hope. The experience of Blessed Mary Eugene in these 2 years is best captured in the words of St. Paul when he said, to the Greeks or to the Jews, it is foolishness. To the Gentiles, it is madness. But to those who are on the path, it is the power and the wisdom of God. The message of the cross, St. Paul was writing, for the Jews was just sheer foolishness. To the Gentiles, it was madness. But to those who are called, St. Paul will say, it is the power and the wisdom of God. We see this playing out in his life. And I would like to speak of his experience in these 2 years under 4 themes. The first will be confronting an empire of influence. The second will be scaling the wall of family resistance. The third will be to consider the unfolding of a new path. Carmel was a new path, unfamiliar, unknown to him. And yet, it seems something of a star guided him. So we just take them one after the other. It's, if you like, far from being a talk, a reflection of something about Blessed Mary Eugene. Confronting an empire of influence. The journey of Blessed Mary Eugene to the priesthood was reaching its peak in 1920, when this young man entered, if you like, some may want to call it a phase of crisis. The crisis was not discerning if I am called to be a priest or not. The crisis was discerning where God wants me to serve as a priest. He was at a crossroad, if you like. And all of those responsible for his training in the seminary, perceived various paths for him. The bishop had its own conception for him. A spiritual director had his own perceived idea for him. But in the depth of his heart, a new path was unveiling itself to him, a path that he didn't know about. Not to listen to the authority, those responsible for his training, would mean opening the door to exit the seminary. But he cannot deny the voice. He can no longer deny what he was experiencing. He is faced with the crisis of vocation within a vocation. He had a vocation. He felt a vocation to the priesthood. But now he's faced with crisis of vocation within a vocation. There is always a vocation within a vocation. Here, we see Blessed Marie Eugene has to deal with so many conflicting voices. And these voices torn him apart. But these voices were of great importance and influence. They were voices that you cannot just neglect. They were voices that you cannot just throw away. The first voice, the first conflicting voice was his own voice. His own voice was the first conflicting voice. And when he was reflecting on this, I call it a formative event in his life, something that formed him. He wrote in 1964, reflecting on this experience. I got this from Gegushe in La Vie de Père Marie Eugene. The translation is mine, so don't worry if you find it difficult. It was after the war. I was at the seminary, and the prioress of the Carmelite monastery had the idea to send me the accent of Mount Carmel of St. John of the Cross. I took the book and began to read it, but without finishing it. I kept it for a few days out of politeness, or to be polite, sorry, that translation is somehow, and returned the book to her and thanked her, but thought within myself, this is not meant for me. To search always for the most difficult, this is an ascetical practice of the giants. That was his first reaction reading the accent of Mount Carmel of St. John of the Cross. This wasn't for me. That was his own voice. He had to confront that voice. And it would seem like the Lord wanted him to understand that it is through John of the Cross that he would understand his path. 13th of December, 1920, Sister Marie Albert gave him an abridged life of St. John of the Cross, written by one of our Carmelite friar, Albert Parham. He read this. The same person is reading about. He read John of the Cross and dismissed it. He read John of the Cross again, and he exclaimed, that is it. He found a path. The path that was already in him came out. God was inviting him to Carmel. Many writers have wondered what changed between reading the accent of Mount Carmel of St. John of the Cross and reading the abridged life of St. John of the Cross. First, reading the accent of Mount Carmel was he met something. You can see the only phrase that he brought out, or one of the prominent phrases that he brought out from reading the Accent of Mount Carmel was that where John of the Cross says that don't search for the simple things, but search for the difficult ones. He held on to that. But that wasn't only what John said. When he read the life of John of the Cross, he met a different man. He met a different saint. And so, wrestling with his own voice, instead, after wrestling with his own voice and coming to conquer his own voice, instead of shouting in joy like St. Therese of the Child Jesus when she discovered her vocation, when she said, "My vocation is love," in a delirious joy, she exclaimed, Therese would exclaim, "I have found my vocation. My vocation is love." But that wasn't the case for Blessed Maria Eugene. He found his vocation, but he would not rejoice. Why? How will he communicate this to those who are in charge? To those who make the decision, if you like. How would he convince the spiritual director of this new experience? It was something new. He wasted no time. The next day, he presented the experience to his spiritual director. But he ended it by saying, I think I'm being foolish by this. And the spiritual director told him, "Oh, yes, I think you are being foolish. But let us see what happens." 18th of December, 1920, he was ordained a sub-deacon. And when he brought up the issue after that, his director said to him, "I don't want to hear this spoken of again. It's enough." Here is another voice that is conflicting, that he has to go through. He has to reconcile these two voices because they were not on the same path. And that moment, he challenged God. This was December 1920. And he told God, "If by Easter my spiritual director doesn't change his mind, then I know that I was mistaken to think that I have found a vocation." He wasn't mistaken in asking God or in challenging God that way. On Good Friday, 25th of March, 1921, he met his spiritual director, who said to him, after discussing about it, that the spiritual director actually told him, "Talk to me about your experience of Carmel again." And at the end of that conversation, what happened? He said to him, "If you don't leave for Carmel, I will force you to leave." That voice was reconciled with the voice he heard in himself. The confirmation was there. So he's no longer doubting if that voice was from God. But having wrestled with this voice of the spiritual director who has given his consent, if you like, he found no peace even at that, because he still has to confront the voice of the one in charge, the bishop. Every seminarian belongs to the bishop. And the bishop has the decision to make. Already the bishop had his plans. Maria Eugene had been ordained a deacon, and the bishop already had the idea to send him on mission. seeing in him a missionary material, if you like. Unknown to him that this young man had another idea. It was not until he made a visit to the Carmel, to the Carmelite monastery at Rhodes, the bishop, that a sister mentioned to him that he should allow a seminarian to answer the call to Carmel. But as is customary, the bishop has to meet with those to be ordained before ordination. And when he met with Blessed Marie Eugene, he said to him, "My friend, my son, you want to join the Carmelites? Go and meet with Father Vabre and do as he instructs you." It wasn't clear on what the bishop meant. Was it that I shouldn't go? Of course, that was what the bishop was saying. You're going nowhere. Go and see Father Vabre. But he would later write to the bishop. And the bishop wrote back to him to tell him, "My son, I gave you a counsel, and that is equal to an order." And so as a former military man, he understands the meaning of an order. And when he met with Father Vabre, the voice of the bishop was clear. He is to be engaged after his ordination in preaching. And we know anything contrary to that is called disobedience, which was and still is the greatest crime for anyone on the journey to the priesthood and even a priest. I call it a crime in quotation mark because it's the worst thing that can happen to anyone, disobedience. However, it was Gegoshe that said this: the bishop had no rest, couldn't sleep, and wrote and said, "Let him go." This was still before his ordination, and the bishop gave his consent. The voice was reconciled. But these voices of influence was not the only thing he had to confront. The next most difficult experience for him was how to scale the wall of family resistance. All the while he was confronting these voices, he kept silent as regards sharing his thought or his experience with his family. Just like Moses, when Moses was born and his mother couldn't hide him anymore, had to bring him out. Blessed Marie Eugene could keep it no longer. And on the 2nd of October, 1921, he took the bold step to tell the mother. The reaction of the mother took him by surprise. The reaction was both scary and dramatic. She fainted, she fell, she even cursed him in her pain. And she even threatened to commit suicide if he goes ahead. She vowed not to attend his ordination. Of course, she eventually changed her mind and went. If nothing else would make this young man change his mind, then the life of his mother, which is on the balance already, which is being threatened, would do the trick. But no. Blessed Marie Eugene was convinced of the voice he heard. With no light, as St. John of the Cross would say, with no light, all the light to guide me, I went out on sin. He said, Maria Eugene, we'll go. Because it seemed like everyone opposed this idea or this experience. And even the vicar of his home parish would say to him, when he saw the mother's condition, you are an assassin. Because you are out to kill your mother. It was as bad as that. For the sake of time, I wouldn't want to go into the reaction of the sister who was really, really disappointed, or the reaction of his friends and the reaction of his other sisters. But looking closely at this, all of those who opposed him had, beneath the opposition, they had their plans for him. Perceived plans. And he had his plan for himself. His mother wanted him to be a parish priest, of course. Somewhere she would go to stay with her son, which was the pride of a mother. The bishop saw him, of course, just before the bishop, the mother thought that going to Carmel was losing him, because she felt like the friars are enclosed like the nuns, because the nuns were known, but the friars were not, because at this time they were expelled. We'll talk about that later. The bishop saw him as a promising missionary, and he saw himself as a priest for eternity. The zeal for the work of a priest was burning in him. All of these people placed their plans of him, and himself placed his own plan on a table. And all of a sudden, God places his own plan on the same table. How do we reconcile all of these conflicted plans? He was to become a Carmelite, was God's plan. But one thing we can look, which is something that touches on, that inspired me, I would say, on my own experience, is that the path God was choosing for him was neither contradictory to the paths that others thought for him, but rather each person thought just an aspect of a life for him, but God thought of the bigger picture. Because as a Carmelite friar, he will fulfill all of those desires and plans. A missionary, as a Carmelite, he was burning with zeal. A priest, parish priest, he was. It was the desire of the mother. A preacher, yes, he was, which was a desire of his spiritual director. God was offering a way that he could accomplish all of these desires that these people have for him. So God was presenting the bigger picture, but everyone had just an aspect. We all have our own formative stories. It brings me to my own experience. Would I have wanted to be a Carmelite? No. Would many of my family want me to be a Carmelite? No. Because my elder brother opposed me all through my formation. He wanted me to be a medical doctor. That I would be a successful medical doctor. But here I am, a medical doctor for God. It is always presenting the bigger picture. What happens at Mass? It's offering medicine for life. At confessional, is offering medicine for reconciliation. I am a doctor. It was a desire of my brother who never wanted me to be a priest. When we read back our own experiences, all of those who wanted something they call better for us or wanted something different for us only sees an aspect. Why God offers the greater picture, the bigger picture, because God sees all things. And so Blessed Mary, his life is offering us a model of hope and courage for us to live fully who we are called to be, listening to the voice of God. But again, going back to that Pauline expression, foolishness and madness was my first reaction to Blessed Mary Eugene. When in all of this, he didn't know anything about the Carmelite friar. He never met them. Yet he was so convinced that he was called to be that. He only knew the nuns. And the life of the friars and the life of the nuns are not the same expressions, but the same life, but different expressions. He went to the monastery of the nuns in Rhodes, but that was all. He had never met a friar. And in fact, the law of July 1st, 1901, affected the friar in France so much that they were, if you like, expelled. And they had to leave France. And they had to flee to Monaco, to Belgium, to Italy, and to Spain, because the law was not favorable to male religious congregations or orders. So as of February 1922, the friars only returned to France gradually in 1920. And the first community was at Avon. So as of February 1922, when Blessed Mary Eugene was ordained, that was the only Carmelite friar monastery in France. Of course, new other monasteries plans have been made already for the establishment of new monasteries as the friars were already coming back. But to speak of how risky it was for a Carmelite friar to exist at that context, at Avon, the friars would not put their name on the wall. As we see, in any community, you have order of discalced Carmelites or the Carmelite community. But rather, what we found in Avon was French Oriental missions. It was a disguised way. It was risky to be a Carmelite friar. And to make matters worse, the Carmelites, the friars, their reputation was already tarnished a few years earlier by one of our Carmelite brothers, Hyacinthe Lucen, a very great preacher, well appreciated at Notre Dame de Paris. He had left the order, married an American Protestant, and they had a son. Of course, in that context and at that time, that was a big shock and a scandal. Although he was excommunicated, he then founded a church, his own church, with a sense of a reformed Catholicism, there opposing the teachings of the First Vatican Council, which just happened a few years earlier, and the pontifical infallibility. So this story was already well known in that context. with the story of the scandal, with the risk of being a Carmelite. What kept this man saying that he wants to still be a Carmelite? There's something just beyond just what I want. This is someone who has resigned to what God wants. Because the only conflict of the human person is how to reconcile my want and God's own. The human will and the divine will. Union with God. The whole essence of prayer is union of wills. When my will is lost, if you like, in God's will. February 24th, 1922. Just less than 3 weeks after his ordination, he arrived in this strange place in Avon. On the human level, we can see that those who raised the objections had valid reasons. I've just listed some of the reasons why it shouldn't, because even the bishop mentioned that you want to be a Carmelite, there you want to encounter hyacinth. The reaction of the bishop already tells him what it is, because the church he founded was already a bone in the neck of the bishops of that place. But he stayed. February 24th, 1922, he arrived. And on 10th of March, 1922, 99 years today, he received the Carmelite habit. And this is the significance of this day. It is 99 years today that he wore the habit that he will live for the rest of his life, died in it. And he chose the name Marie Eugene of the child Jesus. And he will later write the choice of that name and the reason for the choice. And it says that it will remind me of all my mothers, his own mother, biological mother Marie, and Mother Marie Eugene of the Sacred Heart, who was prioress of the Carmelite monastery in Rhodes. And also, he would add the little Therese. He says that the little Therese would have something too, since we would both be of the child Jesus. At this time, Therese was not beatified or canonized. Henceforth, we become completely brother and sister. It was in August 1921 that Benedict XV approved or decreed the heroic virtues of Therese. 1 year after, 11th of March, 1923, he made his profession in Carmel. With the presence of so many, yet the absence of his family. It tells us how much pain they were still going through, even after 1 year. I know Monique gave me the option of 2 dates, the 10th of March and the 11th of March, because those were significant dates for him. But we finally settled for the 10th of March. 10th of March was the reception of his habit, and the 11th of March was his first profession. But entering Carmel, the struggle did not end. It seemed his life was all about struggles. I just want to stay with these 2 years. I don't want to go out of these 2 years of his life. Another struggle he will face will be the separation between the friars and the nuns in France. It's a very complicated situation and context, because at that time, the friars would not step leg in the monastery of the nuns. And Blessed Marie Eugene already had a link with the nuns, would become, if you like, a bridge that would help bring the friars and the nuns in closer relationship. And Gegoshe would write that is the reason why Blessed Marie Eugene, on his souvenir for profession, would choose the gospel passage of Jesus, Ut sint unum, that they be one. This was his deep prayer, that the Carmelites be united in France. This is to tell us that in the midst of all of these adversity and struggles, the man had courage. He had hope. Hope was its only, if you like, light to guide him. He held on to it. The path was not clear. The coast wasn't clear. Everywhere, his journey was blood, if you like. But he went on. He went on. Sorry, our time is running too fast. The fourth part I would like to talk about. You find out that in unpacking the story of Blessed Marie Eugene from my own experience, one would think that these experiences ought to have broken this man. If he was so strong, these experiences should have broken him. But yet, the story made him. The story formed him. The story shaped him to become an instrument for God. It seemed to me, I would call it a guiding star on his path. Because as human, we need something, just no matter how tiny that the thread of hope is, the light, just to walk. We need it. And that is why I'll call this part the guiding star that lightened his path. Just as there were external voices, conflicting external voices, I think, this is my own proposition, Blessed Marie Eugene had also deep spiritual voices that were not conflicting, rather they were affirming. For the sake of time, I will just highlight 3 events of these voices that confirmed his path during these 2 most difficult years of his life. August 14th, 1921, I mentioned earlier on, Therese was declared venerable. Already, Blessed Marie Eugene had special devotion to Therese, especially during the war. He would often ascribe to Therese as the protector of Henri Grialou. And it is to him, although many will context that to say he entrusted this vocation to Therese. And he was so joyful when on the 29th of April, 1923, Pope Pius XI beatified Therese. This was after delays because of the war. But Therese would have been beatified earlier on. And he will write a few days after Therese's beatification. It's a very long letter, but I just picked just excerpt from it. In fact, our joy is great. Personally, I feel like it is one of the most beautiful days of my life. And he was longing for the glorification of Therese, for her to become a saint. And he said, this glorification of the little sister is the form, is the path by which I best understand the glorification of Jesus himself. These were, Therese was a guiding star leading him to Jesus. Therese was a voice that guided him. On January 1921, just before his diaconate ordination, after being ordained as subdeacon, following the warning of his spiritual director, Monsignor Belmont, that he should not speak of his experience to join Carmel again, he, during that period, read 2 books, foundational books. The book of her life of St. Teresa of Avila and the book of the Foundations. These 2 books shaped for Blessed Mary Eugene what Theresian Carmel ought to be. And this is why when he got to Avon, he observed some conflicting experiences. They were conflicting, not contradictory, to what is being lived and what Therese wrote in the Foundations. It's a beautiful experience, which I don't want to go into right now. Well, time is up already, sorry. Teresa's voice will become another guiding star for him. And on the 13th of December, 1920, where we started from, we're returning back to where we started from. We already made allusion to that when you read the ascent of Mount Carmel of John of the Cross, and how at first it made no impression on him, but reading the same person from a different context, he had a new voice. There he discovered his vocation. And what lesson can we draw from this is that sometimes all we need to do is to read a situation differently. Every situation, I believe, serves as a formative event, something that shapes us. They may be bitter, they may be hurtful, they may be wonderful, whatever they are, they serve to form something. Joseph's story in the scripture comes to my mind here. God planned that he will be in Egypt, but it doesn't seem like God planned how he will be in Egypt. Because the experience of him getting to Egypt was not a funny one. But the psalm that we interpret this later, the experience of Joseph, will say, God sent a man ahead of his brothers to Egypt. But the way Joseph got to Egypt, you wouldn't say he was sent. He was bundled and sold against his will. But the interpretation later was, God sent a man. And one spiritual writer will say, when you hear something or read a text and it provokes a reaction in you, whether positive or negative, doesn't matter, then you can leave the text or leave what is said, come back to it. Because sometimes when we fight something, oh, what is said is wrong, what is said is not correct, what is said, deep within, the text has something to say to our own formative experiences. These 3 figures of Carmel, Therese, John of the Cross, and Teresa, would constitute the foundation of the 2 books, major works of Blessed Mary Eugene. I want to see God, and I'm a daughter of the church. He wanted the world to hear these voices that formed or that guided him. He wanted the whole world to hear them, so that it will be guidance for them too. and he will become an apostle of these three who would become doctors of the church. At his time, in his lifetime, John of the Cross was already doctor of the church. He died before Teresa was made doctor of the church in 1970, and Therese, doctor of the church in 1997. So why not we take a look back at our own formative stories and highlight those tiny little voices that kept us going in the midst of adversity, in the midst of opposing voices, in the midst of opposing forces. This is what this aspect of the life of Blessed Marie Eugene is offering us. Courage to stand firm in the face of the storm. The storm may come from ourselves, come from those around us, but only to know God is with us.